The small neighborhood park was alive with the cheerful sounds of children playing on a warm afternoon. The sky above was bright and clear, and the sunlight spread gently across the playground like a soft golden blanket. Colorful slides and swings echoed with laughter as children ran from one corner of the park to another. The sound of happy voices filled the air while parents sat on wooden benches nearby, watching their kids chase each other across the grass. Some children were building small sand castles in the sandbox. Others were climbing the jungle gym while their parents cheered them on. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon where everything felt simple and joyful. But near the quiet corner of the playground, one small boy sat silently in a wheelchair. His name was Tommy. Only 4 years old, Tommy had been born with a physical disability that made it difficult for him to walk like the other children. While most kids ran freely across the playground, Tommy moved around in a small wheelchair designed specially for him. The wheelchair stood beside the sandbox where he could watch the other kids playing. Tommy's curly brown hair moved slightly in the warm breeze as he quietly observed the world around him. Even though he couldn't join the running games, he still enjoyed being there. He loved watching other children laugh. Sometimes he imagined that he was running beside them, climbing the slide or racing across the grass. Despite everything, Tommy tried to smile. He didn't want anyone to think he was sad. Nearby, Tommy's mother Lisa sat on a wooden bench under a large oak tree. She kept a careful eye on her son while answering a quick phone call from work. Lisa worked long hours to support both herself and Tommy, and sometimes the calls came even when she was trying to spend time with him. She glanced toward Tommy every few seconds to make sure he was safe. For the moment, everything seemed calm. But that calm moment didn't last long. From the other side of the playground, 3 older children slowly walked toward Tommy. They looked a few years older than him. At first, they simply stared at the wheelchair. One of them tilted his head curiously. "What's that?" he asked. Another boy stepped closer and leaned down slightly to look at Tommy. Then suddenly, he laughed. "Why can't you walk?" the boy mocked. The question was loud enough for several nearby children to hear. Tommy's smile faded. He looked down quietly at his hands resting on the wheelchair armrest. He didn't know what to say. One of the boys kicked the sand near the wheels of the chair, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. "You're weird," another one said. Tommy's small shoulders lowered slightly. He had heard comments like this before, but it still hurt every time. Then one of the boys leaned closer and spoke again, this time louder. "Cry again, freak." The words hit Tommy like a punch. His eyes filled with tears almost instantly. He tried to hold them back, but he was still just a little kid. A small tear rolled down his cheek. At that exact moment, a deep rumbling sound echoed from the street beside the park. It was the sound of powerful motorcycle engines. The loud roar cut through the cheerful playground noise. Several parents turned their heads toward the road as a line of motorcycles slowly rolled past the entrance of the park. The bikes were large and polished, their chrome shining under the afternoon sunlight. At the front of the group rode a tall biker named Jack. Jack was easy to recognize. He was broad-shouldered with a thick beard and wore a worn black leather biker jacket covered in patches from years of riding with his motorcycle club. The group of bikers had been passing through town during a charity ride, traveling together across several states to raise money for children's hospitals. They weren't planning to stop in this small town. But as the bikes rolled past the park entrance, something unusual caught Jack's attention. From the road, he noticed a small boy sitting in a wheelchair near the sandbox. And the boy was crying. Jack slowed his motorcycle. The rumbling engine dropped to a softer growl as he reduced his speed. Behind him, the other bikers immediately noticed and slowed down as well. Jack looked again toward the playground. The boy still sat there, tears on his face. The three kids who had been teasing him were now walking away laughing. Jack's expression changed. Without saying a word, he gently steered his motorcycle toward the curb beside the park. The other bikers followed. One by one, the powerful bikes rolled to a stop near the entrance. Engines rumbled quietly before the riders shut them off. The sudden silence made the moment feel even more serious. Jack removed his helmet slowly. From across the playground, he could still see the little boy in the wheelchair. Still wiping tears from his face, Jack stepped off his motorcycle, and suddenly, a simple ride through town had turned into something far more important. Jack slowly guided his motorcycle toward the curb near the playground entrance and gently brought it to a stop. The deep rumble of the engine faded as he turned the key and removed his helmet. Behind him, one by one, dozens of other motorcycles rolled to a stop as well. The sudden quiet felt strange after the powerful sound of so many engines. The bikers looked toward Jack, silently waiting to see what had caught his attention. But Jack's eyes were already focused on something else. Across the playground, near the sandbox, the small boy in the wheelchair was still there, and he was wiping tears from his face. Something about the scene didn't feel right. Jack had spent many years riding through towns and cities across the country. During those long rides, he had seen many things. People laughing, people struggling, people helping each other. But he had also seen moments when someone needed help and no one stepped forward. Jack never liked those moments. Without saying anything, he stepped off his motorcycle and placed his helmet on the seat. The other bikers watched quietly as he began walking toward the playground. His heavy boots moved steadily across the sidewalk while the warm afternoon breeze moved gently through the park. The tall biker with the thick beard and black leather jacket might have looked intimidating to most people. But Jack wasn't walking toward the playground to scare anyone. He simply wanted to understand what had just happened. As he approached, the three boys who had been teasing Tommy immediately noticed him. They looked toward the park entrance. Behind Jack stood dozens of bikers watching silently. Large motorcycles lined the curb like a wall of chrome and steel. The laughter that had filled the playground only seconds earlier suddenly stopped. One of the boys swallowed nervously. Another looked down at the ground. Without saying a word, they slowly backed away from Tommy. Then one of them turned and quickly ran across the grass. The others followed. Within seconds, the bullies had disappeared toward the far side of the park. Tommy remained sitting quietly in his wheelchair beside the sandbox. His small hands rubbed his eyes as he tried to wipe away the tears that had fallen down his cheeks. Jack walked closer. When he reached the boy, he stopped and looked down at him for a moment. Tommy looked very small sitting there. His curly brown hair moved slightly in the breeze while his small shoulders still shook from crying. Jack could see that the boy was trying very hard to be brave. But he was only 4 years old. Jack slowly crouched down beside him. He lowered himself so he wouldn't appear tall or frightening. "Hey, buddy," Jack said gently. His deep voice carried a calm warmth that was very different from the loud voices that had been teasing the boy earlier. Tommy looked up slowly. His eyes were still wet from crying. Jack gave him a small reassuring smile. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Tommy nodded slowly. But when he tried to speak, his voice trembled. "They said I'm weird," he whispered. The words were quiet, but they carried a heavy sadness. Jack felt something tighten slightly in his chest. He turned his head briefly and looked toward the empty path where the bullies had disappeared. For a moment, the biker's expression became serious. Behind him, the other bikers were now watching the scene quietly. Dozens of strong men in leather jackets stood near their motorcycles. None of them spoke, but every one of them understood what had happened. Jack turned his attention back to Tommy. The little boy looked down again at his hands resting on the wheelchair. Jack could see that the boy had heard those kinds of words before, and each time it probably hurt just as much. Jack gently rested one hand on the armrest of the wheelchair. "You know something?" Jack said calmly. Tommy looked up again. Jack smiled slightly. "You're not weird." The boy blinked slowly. "You're strong." Tommy stared at him for a moment as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Jack continued speaking in the same calm voice. "You're stronger than most people," he said, "because you keep smiling even when things are hard." Behind them, the other bikers nodded quietly. One of them crossed his arms and looked proudly toward the little boy. Another biker gave Tommy a small encouraging wave. For the first time since the bullies had walked away, Tommy's shoulders slowly relaxed. The tears on his cheeks began to dry. He looked up at Jack again. "Really?" Tommy asked quietly. Jack nodded. "Really?" And in that small moment beside the playground sandbox, the little boy who had just been bullied started to feel something he hadn't felt only minutes earlier. He didn't feel alone anymore. Lisa had only stepped a few feet away from the playground bench when the loud rumble of motorcycle engines caught her attention. She quickly ended her phone call and turned toward the park entrance. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. Several large motorcycles were now parked near the curb beside the playground. The riders stood beside their bikes wearing black leather jackets and heavy boots. There were many of them, dozens. Lisa's heart jumped slightly with worry. Her first instinct was to look toward her son, Tommy. She immediately spotted him near the sandbox, sitting in his wheelchair exactly where she had left him. But now something was different. A tall biker with a thick beard was kneeling beside him, speaking softly. For a brief moment, Lisa felt nervous. Seeing a group of bikers around her small child was not something she had expected to see on a quiet afternoon at the park. She quickly walked across the grass toward them. But as she got closer, she noticed something that made her slow down. The biker wasn't being rough. He wasn't scaring Tommy. In fact, the large man was speaking to him very gently. Tommy had stopped crying. Lisa approached them carefully. "What happened?" she asked, her voice carrying both concern and curiosity. Tommy looked up at her. His eyes were still a little red from crying, but he seemed calmer now. He pointed quietly toward the far side of the playground. "The boy said I'm weird," Tommy explained softly. Lisa's heart sank. She had worried about this day for a long time. The day when other kids might begin noticing that Tommy was different. The day when someone might say something cruel. She knelt down beside her son and gently brushed a small tear from his cheek. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said quietly. Tommy shrugged slightly, trying to act brave. Lisa looked up at Jack. There was a deep sadness in her eyes. "He just wants to play like the other kids," she said softly. Her voice carried the quiet exhaustion of a parent who had spent years trying to help her child feel included in a world that sometimes made that difficult. Jack listened carefully. He looked down at Tommy again. The little boy sat quietly in his wheelchair, staring at the sand beneath him. Despite everything, he was still trying to smile. Jack had met many people during his years riding across the country. He had met tough people, kind people, people who helped others and people who ignored those in need. But something about the little boy in front of him struck him deeply. Tommy wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He simply looked sad. Jack slowly stood up and turned his head toward the street beside the park. The long line of motorcycles stretched along the curb. Chrome gleamed under the afternoon sunlight while dozens of bikers leaned against their bikes watching quietly. Many of them had noticed what had happened. Jack could see it in their faces. They understood. And suddenly, an idea crossed his mind. Jack scratched his beard thoughtfully for a moment. Then he turned back toward Tommy. The little boy looked up at him. Jack smiled. "Hey kid," he said warmly. Tommy blinked. "How would you like to see something cool?" The boy's curiosity immediately appeared on his face. "What?" Tommy asked. Jack pointed toward the street where the motorcycles were parked. Tommy turned his head slowly. His eyes widened slightly. The long row of motorcycles looked huge from where he sat. The shiny bikes looked like something out of a movie. Tommy had never seen that many motorcycles in one place before. "Those are yours?" he asked quietly. Jack chuckled. "Some of them." Tommy stared for another moment. Then he looked back at Jack. "Are they fast?" he asked. Jack laughed softly. "Oh yeah," he said. "Very fast." Behind them, several bikers exchanged amused glances. They could already see where Jack's idea was going. Lisa looked between her son and the group of bikers, unsure what exactly was about to happen. But for the first time since Tommy had been teased earlier, she noticed something wonderful. Her son looked curious again, interested, excited. The sadness that had filled his face only minutes earlier was beginning to fade. Jack leaned down slightly so he was closer to Tommy again. "What do you say?" he asked. Tommy's eyes sparkled. "Okay," he said quietly. Jack nodded once. Then he turned toward the group of bikers standing near the street. "All right, boys," Jack called out loudly. "Let's show him something special." Several bikers immediately straightened up from where they had been standing. Engines were about to start. And within just a few minutes, something incredible was about to happen in the small neighborhood park. Jack reached into the pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out his phone. He stepped a few feet away from the playground while the other bikers waited quietly near their motorcycles. The warm afternoon sun still shined over the park, but something exciting was beginning to build in the air. Jack scrolled through his contacts for a moment. Then he made a quick call. One of the bikers nearby overheard a few of his words. "Yeah? We're at the Maple Street Park," Jack said into the phone. He paused for a moment as the person on the other end listened. Then Jack glanced toward Tommy sitting in his wheelchair near the sandbox. The little boy was watching him with curious eyes. Jack smiled slightly before continuing. "We've got a special kid here," he said. "Think you guys could swing by?" There was a short pause. Then Jack chuckled. "Yeah, Bring everyone." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. One of the bikers standing nearby walked over. "What's the plan?" the man asked. Jack looked toward Tommy again. "We're going to give that kid a day he won't forget," he replied. The biker grinned. "Sounds good to me." At first, nothing seemed to happen. The playground returned to its usual quiet rhythm as children continued playing on the slides and swings. But about 15 minutes later, a distant sound began echoing across the town. A motorcycle engine. Then another. And another. Soon the sound grew louder. Parents sitting on the playground benches began looking toward the road curiously. Children stopped playing and stared toward the park entrance. The sound of engines was getting closer. Then the first motorcycle turned onto the street beside the park. The rider slowed and pulled up beside Jack's bike. He removed his helmet and waved. Behind him came another motorcycle. Then another. Within minutes, several bikes had already arrived. The rumbling engines filled the quiet neighborhood street. Tommy watched the scene with wide eyes. He had never seen so many motorcycles before. Jack walked over and stood beside the boy's wheelchair. "Looks like our friends are starting to show up," he said. Tommy stared toward the street in amazement. But the arrivals didn't stop. More motorcycles appeared at the end of the road. The deep roar of engines echoed across the town as riders turned the corner and rolled toward the park. Parents and children gathered near the playground fence to watch. Some people even pulled out their phones to record what was happening. One biker parked beside Jack, then another. And another. The line of motorcycles kept growing. Soon the number reached 20. Tommy's mouth slowly opened in disbelief. "Wow," he whispered. But the motorcycles kept coming. Soon there were 40. The street beside the park had completely filled with shining bikes and riders wearing leather jackets. Then 60. The rumbling engines sounded like thunder rolling across the quiet neighborhood. Children stood beside the fence cheering as the riders arrived. Tommy couldn't stop staring. His earlier sadness had completely disappeared. Instead, his face was now filled with pure excitement. Finally, after nearly an hour, the last group of riders arrived. The engines slowly shut off one by one. Silence returned to the park. Standing near the playground entrance were 85 bikers. 85. Rows of motorcycles stretched down the street. The riders gathered together near the sidewalk, forming a powerful group of leather jackets and smiling faces. Tommy stared at them in amazement. He had never seen anything like it before. Jack walked over to him. The tall biker knelt beside the wheelchair again so he could look the boy in the eyes. "See all those riders?" Jack asked with a smile. Tommy nodded slowly. Jack pointed toward the crowd of bikers standing proudly near their motorcycles. "Every one of them came to meet you," Jack said. Tommy blinked. "For me?" he asked softly. Jack nodded. "Every single one." The boy looked toward the group again. Several of the bikers waved at him. One gave him a thumbs up. Another tipped his helmet. Tommy's eyes sparkled with amazement. He had started the afternoon feeling small and alone. But now, 85 bikers had come just to see him. And Tommy still couldn't believe it. The small playground had completely transformed from what it had looked like earlier that afternoon. Just a short time ago, the park had been quiet and ordinary, children playing, parents watching from benches, and a little boy sitting sadly in his wheelchair. Now the scene felt almost unbelievable. The entire street beside the park was filled with motorcycles. Rows of powerful bikes stretched along the curb, their chrome shining brightly in the warm afternoon sunlight. The engines had gone quiet for the moment, but the presence of 85 bikers created an energy that everyone in the park could feel. Parents stood near the playground fence watching with curiosity. Children gathered in small groups, pointing excitedly toward the motorcycles. But the most amazed person of all was Tommy. The little boy sat in his wheelchair beside the sandbox, staring at the massive group of bikers who had arrived just for him. His eyes moved from one motorcycle to another. They looked huge, shiny, powerful. It was like something straight out of a movie. Jack stood beside him with a small everything that was happening. One of the bikers stepped forward. He was a large man with gray hair in his beard and a warm, friendly expression. "Mind if I help him up?" he asked Lisa gently. Tommy's mother hesitated for just a moment, but she could see the kindness in the biker's eyes. She nodded. "Just be careful," she said softly. "Of course," the biker replied. He knelt carefully beside Tommy's wheelchair. "All right, little man," he said with a smile. "Let's get you a better seat." With gentle hands, the biker carefully lifted Tommy from the wheelchair. The boy was small and light, and the biker held him securely as if he were protecting something very important. Tommy looked slightly surprised at first, but he quickly realized what was happening. The biker walked toward one of the motorcycles parked nearby. It wasn't just any motorcycle. This one had been specially prepared. Another biker had already attached a wide padded seat on the back to make sure Tommy could sit safely. Jack stood beside the bike, steadying it with both hands. "You're going to sit right here," Jack explained. Tommy's eyes grew wide. "Really?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Really?" The biker gently placed Tommy onto the special seat and helped him sit comfortably. Jack handed him a small pair of protective gloves that one of the riders had brought over. "Hold on tight," Jack said with a grin. Tommy wrapped his small hands around the handlebars in front of him. Jack climbed onto the motorcycle behind him, making sure the boy was completely secure. Then he pressed the starter button. The engine roared to life. The deep rumble of the motorcycle vibrated through the air, but instead of looking scared, Tommy's eyes filled with excitement. For the first time that entire day, he was smiling again. A big, bright smile. The kind of smile that only a child can show when something magical is happening. Jack slowly eased the motorcycle forward. The bike rolled gently along the park path while the other bikers started their engines as well. One by one, the motorcycles joined the slow ride around the park. But they moved very carefully. No racing, no loud revving. Just a calm, respectful parade. Children clapped and cheered from the grass. Parents smiled as they watched the incredible moment unfold. Tommy waved his hand happily at everyone watching. His laughter echoed across the playground. The same playground where only a short time earlier he had been sitting quietly with tears in his eyes. Lisa stood near the bench watching her son ride slowly past on the motorcycle. Her hands covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. But this time they were tears of joy. For years she had worried about moments like this, moments when her son might feel different or excluded. But today something amazing had happened. A group of strangers had turned a painful moment into a beautiful memory. The motorcycles continued riding slowly around the park in a wide circle. 85 bikers forming a protective, joyful parade. And right at the center of it all sat a little boy named Tommy, waving happily, smiling brighter than he had all day. The atmosphere in the park had completely changed. Only a short time earlier, the playground had been filled with an uncomfortable silence around the little boy in the wheelchair. The cruel words of a few bullies had made the afternoon feel heavy and sad. But now everything was different. The park was alive with laughter again. Children ran across the grass toward the long row of motorcycles parked beside the playground. The shiny chrome reflected the warm sunlight as the engines cooled after the slow ride around the park. Parents stood nearby smiling as they watched the scene unfold. Some of them were still shaking their heads in disbelief. No one had expected something like this to happen in their quiet neighborhood park. Dozens of bikers stood beside their motorcycles, talking with the families and answering excited questions from curious children. "Are those bikes really that fast?" one boy asked. A biker laughed. "Fast enough to get you into trouble if you're not careful," he joked. Another child pointed toward the large tires of a motorcycle. "They're huge," she said. The biker knelt beside her and smiled. "That's because these bikes are built for long roads," he explained. But the center of attention wasn't the motorcycles. It was Tommy. The little boy sat proudly in his wheelchair near the park path while children gathered around him. Just a short time ago, those same children had been playing their own games, barely noticing him sitting quietly near the sandbox. Now they were cheering for him. One little girl clapped her hands excitedly. "That was awesome," she said. Another boy gave Tommy a thumbs up. "You looked like a real biker," he said. Tommy laughed softly. His earlier sadness had completely disappeared. The boy who had been wiping tears from his eyes earlier that afternoon now looked happier than anyone in the park. Lisa stood nearby watching the scene with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She still couldn't fully believe what had just happened. A group of strangers had stepped into her son's life at exactly the moment he needed it most. And they hadn't just comforted him. They had given him confidence. They had shown him that he mattered. Jack walked over and stopped beside Tommy's wheelchair. The tall biker looked down at the little boy with a warm smile. Tommy looked up at him. "Did you like the ride?" Jack asked. Tommy nodded quickly. "It was the coolest thing ever," he said excitedly. Jack chuckled softly. "I'm glad you liked it." For a moment they both looked out across the playground. Children were still exploring the motorcycles while the bikers talked with parents and teachers. The atmosphere felt joyful, but Jack knew something important. Moments like this were wonderful, but the words people carried inside them could last much longer. Jack crouched down beside Tommy again so they were eye level. The boy looked curious. Jack placed a gentle hand on the armrest of the wheelchair. "Hey," he said calmly. Tommy listened carefully. Jack spoke slowly so the boy would remember the words. "Remember something." Tommy nodded. "You're stronger than anyone who tries to hurt you." Tommy blinked. Jack continued. "Sometimes people say mean things because they don't understand others." He gestured gently toward the playground. "But being different doesn't make you weak." Tommy thought about the words for a moment. Then he smiled. "I like being different," he said. Jack laughed. "That's the spirit." Behind them, several bikers had been listening to the conversation. One of them gave Tommy a thumbs up. Another clapped his hands once. "Strong kid," he said proudly. Lisa walked over and stood beside them. "Thank you," she said quietly to Jack. Her voice carried deep gratitude. "I don't think he'll ever forget this day." Jack shrugged slightly. "We just helped a friend," he replied. Tommy looked up at the long line of motorcycles again. For the first time in his life, the little boy didn't feel like the child who was different. Instead, he felt like the hero of the whole park, and everyone around him was cheering. As the warm afternoon slowly began turning into evening, the golden sunlight stretched long shadows across the playground. The excitement that had filled the park for the past hour was slowly settling into a calm and peaceful atmosphere. The engines of the motorcycles had cooled, and the laughter of children gradually softened as families began preparing to head home. But the memory of what had just happened still hung in the air. For many people in the park, it had been one of the most unusual afternoons they had ever seen. A quiet playground had suddenly turned into the gathering place for 85 bikers, all showing up for one small boy who had needed a little kindness. Now, as the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, the bikers began preparing to leave town. One by one, they walked back toward their motorcycles parked along the street beside the park. The chrome of the bikes reflected the warm orange glow of the setting sun. Helmets were picked up. Gloves were pulled on. Engines were checked. The familiar sound of metal clicking and boots stepping on pavement filled the air. Tommy sat in his wheelchair near the playground entrance, watching everything carefully. His eyes moved across the long line of motorcycles as the riders prepared for their next journey. Just a few hours earlier, he had been sitting in the same spot feeling small and alone. Now he felt completely different, proud, happy, and somehow stronger. His mother Lisa stood behind him with one hand resting gently on his shoulder. She had spent years worrying about how the world would treat her son. But today, she had seen something beautiful. Strangers had stepped forward with kindness when it mattered the most. And that kindness had changed everything. Jack walked toward Tommy one last time before leaving. The tall biker removed his gloves and tucked them into his jacket pocket as he approached the wheelchair. Tommy looked up and smiled the moment he saw him. "You're leaving?" the little boy asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We've still got a long road ahead of us." Tommy looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked back up again. "Thank you," he said happily. His voice was full of excitement and gratitude. Jack smiled warmly. He reached out and gently tapped the side of the wheelchair. "Ride strong, kid," he said. Tommy grinned. "I will." Behind them, the first motorcycle engine roared to life. The deep rumbling sound echoed through the quiet evening air. Then another engine started, and another. Soon the street beside the park filled once again with the powerful sound of motorcycles preparing for the road. Parents and children gathered along the fence to watch the bikers leave. Some waved. Others clapped quietly. The riders climbed onto their motorcycles one by one, adjusting their helmets as they prepared to ride. Jack walked back to his bike and swung one leg over the seat with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times before. He placed his helmet on and looked back toward the playground. Tommy was still there. The little boy raised his hand and waved excitedly from his wheelchair. Jack lifted his hand slightly in return. Then he pressed the starter button. The engine roared beneath him. One by one, the motorcycles slowly began moving forward. The long line of bikes rolled down the street, their headlights glowing softly as the sun continued setting behind the buildings of the small town. Tommy watched until the very last motorcycle disappeared around the corner. For a moment, the street became quiet again. But the feeling in the park had changed forever. Tommy turned to his mother with a huge smile. "That was the best day ever," he said. Lisa smiled back at him. "I think it was," she replied. The golden sunlight slowly faded as evening arrived. And somewhere far down the road, the sound of motorcycles continued echoing across the highway. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they don't appear in movies or news headlines. Sometimes they simply arrive when someone needs them the most. And sometimes, those heroes ride away on motorcycles.